Hey everyone, I wanted to give you an idea of, again, why I have such a difficult time making videos. So, as you
Jack
fill
Josie.
out the opposites,
Be still.
this is why. This is why I can't. It's like this is all the time with them. Okay, so welcome. Today what we are going to be doing is opposite notes and assignments. So opposites. You guys know opposites. High, low, left, right, whisper, shout. So if you want, just take a minute to fill out as many of these as you can think of. So how do opposites relate to math? What is the opposite of positive? The opposite of positive, of course, is negative. And so the opposite of negative is positive. So we know this. So if we're talking about opposite numbers, every number has its opposite. So where is 8 on the number line? So this is an easy one. 8 is right there. And its opposite would then, if the opposite of positive is negative, the opposite of positive 8 is negative 8. And then it's, how are they related to 0? So find 0 on the number line. And this is more of a common sense. Josie, stop. Here's 0. So how are they related? 8 is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 units to the right, 8 units to the right of 0, where negative 8 is 8 units to the left. Oops, I want to get rid of that negative because it's not negative 8 units to the left, it's just 8 units to the left. 8 units to the left. So they're on opposite sides of 0. One is to the right, which is opposite of left. So opposite numbers are the same number but on opposite sides of 0. Okay, so take a moment to locate and label the opposites of all of these numbers on the number line. So the opposite of 9, we're going to switch the sign. The opposite of 9 is negative 9. The opposite of negative 2 is a positive 2. Now I have my daughter singing in the background. Oops, I meant to label it like this. A, B. The opposite of 4 is negative 4. So we're going to find negative 4 on the number line. And that is C. And D, the opposite of negative 7, is 7. Pretty easy stuff. So now this is where your active reading comes in, because we want to know if I just read this 100 feet above sea level. 100 feet above sea level, that was in the last lesson. We know that's going to be a positive 100, which we don't label with that plus sign or the positive symbol. We just say if it's 100 feet above sea level, it's 100. But that's not what this question is asking. The directions, and this is, again, active reading. You need to read the directions. Write the integer that represents the opposite of each situation. The opposite. So the opposite of 100 is a negative 100. And what does 0 mean in this situation? 0 means sea level. 30 degrees below 0. Well, 30 degrees below 0 is negative 32. Sorry, I think I said 30. 32 degrees below 0. Because if it's below 0, it's going to be negative. But we want to know its opposite. So that's the opposite of negative 32 is a positive 32. And in this case, 0 means 0 temperature. And you could probably think of a better way to describe that, temperature. A withdrawal of 25. If we're withdrawing, that's a negative, but we want to know the opposite. So a positive 25. And in this case, 0 means no withdrawal or deposit. So when we talk about explaining what 0 means in the situation, we have to talk about not just 0, we have to put it in the context of the problem. The context of the problem. All right, on a number line, locate and label 20 degrees Celsius below 0 and 20 above. What does 0 represent? Well, 20 degrees below 0 is opposite than 20 degrees above. So, and I'm going to make this bigger for us. See if you can do that. I suggest, since I know I need to get to below 0, 20 degrees and above 0, and I only have this small number line, I'm going to choose to put 0 right in the middle, and I'm going to use a scale that fits. If I go by 1 and 2, that's not going to allow me to get all the way up to 20 and down to negative 20. So choose a good scale and then see if you can label and locate. All right, so this is how I did it. I put an A above this, and I numbered my number line by tens to make sure that I got both to 20 and to negative 20. I found my negative 20, which is the 20 degrees below 0, and I labeled it A. And then the 20 degrees above 0, I labeled B. And what does 0 represent? Well, because we know we're talking Celsius, 0 is the freezing temperature of water. All right, I want you to try to read this question carefully and come up with your integers, and then come back to check your work. All right, so a proton represents a positive charge. You're going to be reading, or if you've not already learned this in science, you're going to. Proton, positive charge. So if I have 5 protons, if it's a positive charge, I'm going to represent it with a 5. An electron represents a negative charge. So if I want to write an integer, remember an integer is just a positive or negative number without parts. So all the whole numbers and their opposites. To represent 3 electrons, that would be a negative 3. Pretty easy. All right, so this is where it might get a little tricky. You have to read and think about it carefully. So we're going to just start back with our opposite. So what is the opposite of on? That's easy. It's off. So what is the opposite of that? Well, if the opposite of on is off, the opposite of that is back to on. So what is and this is, you got to read it carefully, what is the opposite of on? Well, the opposite of on, so the opposite of on is off, and the opposite of that is back to on. So the opposite of on is on. And we could, what is the opposite of the opposite of the opposite of on? But most of the time we just see it one cycle. The opposite of on is on. So let's try it again. What's the opposite of right? We know that is left. So what is the opposite of this? Of course, that would be right. So the opposite of right, so the opposite of right has to be right. And here again is why. The opposite of right is left, and the opposite of that is back to right. One more time. What's the opposite of positive? Negative. What's the opposite of negative? Positive. So what's the opposite of positive? Well, if the opposite of positive is negative, the opposite of the opposite would be back to, the opposite of positive would be back to positive. So in each of these cases, you can see that when you're taking the opposite of anything, so the opposite of the opposite, you get back to your original whatever it is that you're talking about. Okay, so again, the opposite of the opposite gets us back to the beginning. The opposite of dog is cat. The opposite of cat is dog. So the opposite of dog is back to dog. Let's see how this relates to numbers. Okay, so the opposite of 8 we know is -8. The opposite of that, so the opposite of this, is a +8. So if we took the opposite of 8, the opposite of 8 is -8, and if we took the opposite of that, it would be a +8. Again, in other words, it gets us back to what we started with. Now, in math, we write it like this. This symbol right here can mean opposite. So the opposite of 8. So this is really just saying we could write this the opposite of -8. So the opposite of 8, or the opposite of -8, is a +8. So given this, I want to talk about this symbol. And this is something that I will emphasize to you for a while to come. This symbol, just like words, you have to have it in context. There are some words that have 2 different meanings, and you have to have it in context to know which of the meanings you're meaning, which of the definitions you're meaning, like this word general. General, you know, is a rank in the army. You could have that type of general, or you could have in general, like this. So a broad statement. So for us to know which general we're talking about, we need it in context. It is similar to this symbol. So here, if I just showed you this, we would think of this symbol as meaning negative. If I'm showing it to you like this, though, it means opposite. If it was written in a numerical sentence like 9 minus 3, then we think of this symbol as minus. So we know that this symbol can mean minus, it can mean opposite, or it can be negative. And you have to look carefully to see which one it's talking about. But remember, even with something like this, and actually it's not remember, what you're going to see next year, if you don't get to the learning target this year, is we can change this problem to 9 plus a -3. So that symbol again means minus, opposite, negative. So let's complete some problems. I'm going to say the opposite of -10, or the opposite of 10. The opposite of -10 is 10. Where here, the opposite of 8 is -8. So some of what you're going to have to do on your assignment is this. Write an equation to represent the opposite of a debt of -500. So the opposite of a debt, and I disagree with this. I think I might have had a typo there. The opposite of the debt. So if you had a debt of 500, and the opposite of that is what we're looking for, then we would have the opposite of -500 is 500. So so here's your equation. So write an equation. And again, an equation has an equal sign. So I have an equal sign, so that was an equation. Now if I want to write an equation to represent the opposite of a credit, so the opposite of a credit of 500 would be a negative 500. So really the opposite of a credit is a debt. The opposite of a debt is a credit. So in general, the opposite of A would be A. These two symbols, these two opposites, cancel each other out. All right, hopefully that gives you enough knowledge to finish your assignment. Make sure you ask questions if you have any. We out.